The shuttle's cabin lights dimmed to a desert dawn hue as the instructor recited the rules with the clipped neutrality of a machine. 3 standard days, no external assistance, retrieve a beacon from the center of the test range, reach the extraction ridge by the 3rd sunset. The recorded voice pretended to be a person, but the cadets knew that the desert did not care about rules or voices. The human cadet sat strapped in at the end of the bench, helmet unsealed, eyes half-lidded as if he were memorizing the rhythm of the shuttle's hull rather than the briefing. He did not fidget the way the crystalline Velkari did when a storm cell pinged their bodies, and he did not stretch for show the way the reptilian Corvins liked to do before a trial. He breathed slowly through his nose and let the hot metal scent of the cabin settle over his tongue like a thin film. Heat, noise, impatience. He wanted those sensations now so that when the world outside tried to drown him in harsher versions, nothing would feel new. He had packed differently from his classmates. He wore a plain sand cloak over the academy suit, not the radiant cooler cape the quartermaster insisted was superior. He had declined the microfan mask because he had learned long ago that small spinning parts failed exactly when a storm stripped grit with the precision of knives. He carried a simple canteen, a braided cord of synth fiber, a bone needle tucked into a wrist seam, and an emergency knife with a dull gray blade that never flashed. When the Velkari quartermaster saw the requisition form, he clicked his glassy jaws and told him that minimalism turned into bravado in deserts, and bravado turned into bones. The human thanked him and kept the list exactly as written. Across the bench, a sylphid cadet named Arasa tightened a soft circlet over a smooth brow. Arasa's species had membranes behind the ears that could sense pressure waves, an advantage in the open dunes. He watched Arasa out of habit, not envy. He liked seeing how others trusted their bodies. Every species rose from a planet that taught a different lesson. The dunes would give everyone the same lecture in a vocabulary of heat and abrasion. He wanted to know how each cadet planned to argue back. The shuttle bucked once as it punched through a high, dry inversion layer. The window slats glowed and then cooled. He could taste the change as if the air had been rinsed with steel shavings. He closed his eyes and imagined 3 days mapped in hours, not in kilometers. He did not think about the finish line. He thought about shade and wind direction at noon, about the way sand behaved near hardpan, about the time of evening when air moved like a tide running home. He thought about sleep, because sleep was a tool, not a prize. He had once slept under a drainage pipe during a training cyclone because the pipe offered the exact rhythm of a lullaby. Steady, low, the kind of sound that held panic like a hand held a hot coal until it cooled. He had learned to sleep inside fear, and the desert would make an excellent bed if he chose the mattress correctly. The ramp slammed open and a slab of light poured in. It was not white. It was the pale beige of ground bone. Heat smacked his face so hard his eyes watered even before he moved. The instructors waited under reflective tarps with faces lost behind mirrored veils, and an assistant stamped each cadet's wrist with a contactless timer. The human stepped into the light and let his shoulders loosen. Let the first sweat rise and vanish as if the air were drinking him. Sand lay in all directions, but the kind of sand changed every few strides. He could see, even from the ramp, where dune backs sharpened into scimitars, where hollows wore ripple marks like fingerprints, where a streak of darker grit suggested iron grains. On the far horizon, some low shapes made a ragged necklace against the sky. He did not stare. He took one glance only. He knew the desert did not like to be watched the way a beast disliked a hand on its throat. He catalogued the wind first. Wind did not blow in deserts. Wind poured. He crouched, scooped a pinch of grit, and let it fall near his boot. The grains slid north-northeast with an eagerness that said the wider pressure field leaned south. He looked at the sun's height, at the thin whitish haze that sometimes meant the day would cook until metal cried. He licked the edge of his lip and tasted alkali. The Velkari spread out with glittering confidence, planting poles that hummed and built a quick green sheen of shield between them and the sun. The Corvins unrolled scale capes and lay belly down to let their bodies equalize to ground heat. Arasa tapped a sensor to read subsonic signatures and smiled at the stability line creeping across the display. The human walked away from the noise of setup. He did not want to waste the first hour of morning on display. He wanted a ridge where the wind wrote true sentences. He moved in a long, slanting line, keeping his feet light, never letting his boots punch deep enough to leave sharp edges that would later cut his own ankles when he returned along his sign. He did not let his cloak flap. The desert counted flutter as weakness. He passed crust that rang with a brittle ping when his heel tested it. Fragile evaporates over nothing. He passed a patch of powder so fine that it ate his ankle to the bone and then spat him out with a hiss. He memorized 3 landmarks so ugly no mirage would copy them. A twisted ferrous rock with a black seam, a cluster of pitted nodules that resembled a broken jaw, and a dry thorn that split into 7 points like a bad star. He did not memorize beautiful things. Beautiful things in deserts were lies. The first instructor drone buzzed low at lunch hour, dropping a thermal marker and a packet with thin electrolyte strips. He ignored the marker. He sucked a strip like hard candy and watched the sky while the sun hammered his shoulders. The sky had 2 qualities that mattered: the color just above the horizon and the shimmer at mid-height. He looked for the faint yellow bruise that sometimes meant fine dust aloft. It was there, but it was not thick. He placed that information on a shelf in his mind and did not label it danger or safety. He labeled it later. He followed ground that rose so lazily, his knees barely noticed. He stopped when the air above a certain ripple stayed oddly cool on his tongue, the way air tasted near a human river at dusk. He shifted his stance and felt a breath that came from below. The dune was exhaling. He knelt, pressed his ear to the sand, and listened to the slow, soft collapse of grains just beneath the crust. He smiled. He had found a whisper ridge, one that would keep him informed if the wind wanted to play with structure. He shaded his eyes and looked again at the far necklace of low shapes. He did not know the species of every desert plant on this world, and he did not need to. He only needed to know patterns. Clusters grew where long memory told water to sleep. Water could be gas held in cells, or liquid trapped in a seam, or ice like salt in a shadow. He noted the angle of those shapes relative to the ridge, and then let the horizon fall out of his mind. He laid the cloak on the sand and weighted 2 corners with his boots, then rested with his chest down and his cheek to the grit. He let his breathing flatten until the heat stopped pounding at the cage of his ribs. He counted to 60 twice, lips closed, saliva tucked under his tongue like a private coin. He did not drink yet. The canteen's weight was a promise he refused to believe too early. He slept for 7 minutes, the kind of nap that put oil back in hinges. When he woke, the sun had shifted, and a thin, convective snake danced far off where the hardpan began. He stood and walked on, not because distance mattered, but because the body needed rhythm, so that panic would have no foothold when evening brought an edge to the wind. He crossed a field of half-buried stones and stopped again to examine a dark crescent in the lee of one of them. He pinched the crescent, rubbed it between finger and thumb, and smelled something like copper and old rain. The desert kept secrets in the smallest shadows. He wrote this place into his memory with a plain name: Stone Rain. Names that sounded like poetry turned into mistakes. He shifted back to the ridgeline and finally allowed himself 2 mouthfuls of water, one to swallow and one to hold and roll under his tongue before it vanished. He remembered the instructor's last remark on the shuttle. Storms were scheduled into the test to ensure standardized difficulty. He did not believe in scheduled weather. He believed in what the sky intended and what the ground allowed. He used the rest of the afternoon to map the wind's temperament the way a sailor mapped a bay. He tested the way sand poured over the crest, watching for heavy grains that jumped rather than flowed, a sign of gust energy. He watched birds, 2 small scavengers that flew low with wings held in a shallow V. When birds insisted on the edge of the air, higher air had teeth. He pulled the cloak tighter and kept his pace lazy, the way a man walked who had no appointments. He resisted the urge to set any kind of shelter at first camp. He rejected the illusion that a rectangle of fabric offered respect from a place that measured in centuries and storms. He chose a hollow that offered two gifts: the promise of sound by the ridge if the wind rose, and a floor firm enough to hold a shallow scrape without collapsing sideways. He widened the hollow with his hands until the sand accepted his shape, then lay in it and let the curve match his spine. He ate a strip of pressed grain and protein that tasted like cardboard roasted in sun, and he chewed slowly because chewing was movement, and movement staved off the little madness that began at the back of the mouth when a man's tongue pleaded for sweetness. He looked at his hands and flexed them. Sand had already found the tiny scars near his knuckles and polished them. He felt good. He felt small in the correct way. Small meant the world did not need to notice him. He wanted the world not to notice him. As dusk bled into the dunes, he counted breaths to keep cataloging the air. The wind shifted twice and settled into a patient pull from the south, not urgent, not hungry. He smelled a faint resin note, like a wounded plant. He did not chase the smell. He let the night build its own rules. He watched the stars come up, not as diamonds, but as tiny cold instructions. He aligned his body to them, left shoulder toward a familiar triad, and closed his eyes without closing his awareness. He let his mind catalog the day's store of small, useful truths: the ridge that whispered, the necklace of low shapes briefly seen and then ignored, the convective snake at hardpan, the birds with the shallow V, the taste of alkali, the dark crescent of stone rain. He placed each item on a shelf labeled context rather than plan. Plans broke when a place like this rolled over in its sleep. Context bent and held. He slept and woke in 8-minute cuts, resetting his position each time, careful to keep his footprints few and his weight low. Just before full night, the wind reached under the ridge and murmured a different word. He felt grit kiss his cheek. He opened his eyes and listened. The sound had a new timbre, a soft hiss layered with a high, dry whisper that spoke of grains beginning to leap. Not a storm's voice, not yet, but the childhood of one. He did not sit up. He let the information enter and settle. He had come to the desert to be taught. The desert had begun to teach. He smiled into the sand and let sleep take him again, ready to wake before dawn and move in the hour when the world promised honesty. The morning broke with a dull light that seemed to come not from the sun, but from the desert itself, a pale glow that washed everything in the same unforgiving tone. The human opened his eyes without a start, as though he had not truly been asleep, but only resting beneath the sand's weight. His body moved with deliberate slowness as he rose, brushing grit from his shoulders, and he stretched his arms until his joints whispered. The night had offered him fragments of rest, small enough to be fragile yet sharp enough to keep his mind aligned. Now the desert was awake, and it wanted to remind every living thing of its authority. He walked uphill to the ridge where the wind had whispered before and stood with one boot anchored against the crust. The air was heavier than it had been in the night. It pressed differently, a hand not yet closed into a fist, but preparing to clench. The human's ears caught a faint whistle that came not from one direction but from several, converging like lines of tension across the dunes. He squinted and saw the beginnings of a haze far to the east, not the high white smear of heat, but a thicker, lower smear that crawled instead of floated. He knew what it meant. The storm was not here yet, but it had already started somewhere beyond sight, dragging its tail across the horizon like a predator testing the edges of its cage. He descended and studied the ground with the patience of a craftsman. His hands traced the sand's face, feeling where grains had shifted more sharply than usual, where ripples leaned in odd angles, where the desert had tried to move and been stopped by something unseen. Every sign pointed to pressure rising. The desert was bracing itself. He pressed his lips together and thought about shade. Not the temporary kind that cloth provided, but the kind that existed because the land itself allowed it. Shade carved into living matter. He walked westward with long strides, keeping his cloak wrapped tight against the small bursts of wind that now teased with growing frequency. His eyes locked on the horizon where shapes still slouched like tired sentinels, uneven and swollen. He had only glanced at them the day before, but now he gave them his full attention. Their rhythm across the distance was wrong for rock formations. Rocks spread in sharp angles, while these shapes rose swollen and almost round, clumped in loose gatherings. He quickened his pace. As he moved, the first sign of other cadets appeared behind him. Far down a sloping dune, he saw the crystalline Velkari gathering in a wide circle, planting more shield poles and building an enlarged barrier against the wind. The faint shimmer of their field quivered under the pressure, already strained though the storm had not arrived. Their voices rang brittle as glass, loud with confidence, but tinted with an unease that betrayed what they feared. To the south, he caught sight of a Corvan crawling into a shallow trench, spreading his cape across his body like armor plating. His movements were slow, precise, as though rehearsed many times before. Each cadet trusted what his species had taught him to trust. The human turned back west, uninterested in what would happen to them if their strategies failed. He was not cruel. He was focused. The uneven horizon swelled closer with every step until individual outlines began to separate from one another. He saw tall, columnar growths, their sides ridged and scarred, pale green under the sun, but armored with spines that bristled in thick lattices. Giant cacti, towering far above his height, each one swollen with the memory of water. He slowed as he approached, respect making his feet careful. He circled one plant, studying how the wind funneled around its bulk, how the sand piled against its leeward side, how the spines groaned faintly under the first heavy gusts. His hand hovered near the surface but did not touch. He knew that each cactus was a fortress both in defense and in utility. Water lived inside those swollen ribs, water thickened into pulp that cooled and held against the fire of the day. He remembered fragments of stories, half-forgotten lessons about desert wanderers on Earth who carved openings into similar giants and lived long enough to leave tracks where no one should have walked. The cactus stood like a library waiting to be read, and he had always been a good reader. He studied the lowest ridges where the spines thinned and where scars had formed from ancient impacts. There he found a seam that looked less armored, a weak line where his knife might find purchase. He knelt and pressed his palm against the warm flesh of the plant, feeling the faint vibration of stored water moving beneath. It was alive in a way the desert around him was not, a breathing reservoir disguised as a thorned sentinel. He pulled the knife from his belt and set its dull edge against the seam. He did not stab. He leaned into the blade slowly, carving with patience. The cactus resisted at first, fibers thick and stubborn, but the knife coaxed them apart without splintering. A sweet, damp scent rose from the cut, filling his nose with a relief that felt almost sinful in the dry air. He worked deeper until the blade slid through softened flesh, and a narrow gap opened into darkness inside. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm and widened the gap until it could accept his shoulders. He listened for the groan of structural weakness, but heard none. The plant would hold him if he entered. The storm would rage soon, and this was his refuge. He climbed inside, pressing sideways to avoid spines, and crouched in the cool chamber within. The walls glistened with moisture, faintly translucent, glowing where sunlight pushed through. The air smelled green, thick, and alive, as though he had stepped from a graveyard into a hidden garden. He sat on the soft pulp, leaning his back against a curved wall, and breathed slowly until the tension in his chest dissolved. Outside, the wind had begun to moan. He heard the whine of sand gnashing against spines, a hiss that built into a rising roar. He knew the storm was gathering teeth now, a monster approaching the cadence of rage. He closed his eyes in the dimness, counting the rhythm of the cactus's heartbeat, and let the noise become distant. His mind settled into the calm of a man who had found the exact bed the desert offered him. While others would cling to their shields or fight against collapsing trenches, he would sleep. He did not smile, but the corner of his lips bent with quiet satisfaction. He had listened. He had trusted the language of the land, and the land had given him a place to endure. The cactus held him as the wind outside screamed louder, rattling the world into chaos, but inside he remained still, ready to let the storm break and pass without ever touching him. The roar came gradually, first like a distant murmur pressed against the walls of the cactus, then like a heavy drumbeat hammering closer with every minute. Inside, the human sat still, his knees pulled slightly toward his chest, his back pressed against the cool pulp that lined the chamber. The sound thickened until it became a continuous bellow, a chorus of countless grains of sand hurled across the desert by a wind that no wall of technology could soften. The cactus vibrated under the assault, its outer spines clattering as if struck by iron rods, yet the chamber within remained firm, holding its shape like a rib cage built to withstand centuries of storms. Darkness pooled thicker inside, for the light outside had vanished behind a curtain of dust. The only illumination came from faint green glimmers seeping through the moist walls, a living lantern diffused into shadows. The air was damp enough to cling to his throat, and with every breath he tasted the bittersweet tang of plant flesh and stored water. It was not comfortable, but it was safety, and safety was the rarest currency in a desert storm. The storm raged harder as the hours dragged, no longer whispering or moaning, but howling with a voice that shook the ground. Sand struck like knives. He could hear sharp rattles as fragments of rock, stripped from dune ridges, were hurled against the cactus, but the plant flexed and absorbed the impact. He rested his hand against the inner wall, feeling it tremble yet endure. His mind did not drift into panic. He let the rhythm of the storm become a kind of lullaby, chaotic yet predictable, and his eyelids grew heavy. He slept in fragments, each one no longer than a handful of breaths, waking only to shift his weight when his legs tingled or when a louder impact made the chamber quiver. Beyond his refuge, the desert turned into a graveyard of mistakes. Shields cracked when the static charges of the storm shorted their emitters, leaving crystalline cadets exposed to the full fury of the sand. Trenches filled with choking dust until even the armored corvins struggled to breathe. Those who had trusted membranes and natural armor clawed at the ground for purchase as dunes reshaped themselves, burying what had seemed safe an hour before. The desert gave no forgiveness. It measured arrogance with a simple scale: endurance. And those who had miscalculated felt its judgment swiftly. Inside, the human allowed himself to dream lightly, not of rescue or triumph, but of other deserts he had read about, those on his own world. He thought of the Sonoran, where tall cacti also grew and held water for those who knew to ask gently. He thought of the Sahara, where caravans once traced paths across an endless sea of sand and trusted the night sky to be their compass. He thought of those who had died nameless in deserts that stretched across continents, men and women who had simply stopped walking when the sun burned away hope. He honored them in silence, reminding himself that survival was never an achievement of pride, but one of humility. He survived because he listened, because he was small enough to learn. When he woke again, the storm's pitch had changed. It no longer roared with youthful ferocity, but groaned like an old beast beginning to tire. The impacts against the cactus had softened into muffled sighs, though the wind still screamed high above the dunes. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, not yet moving, because he knew that a storm's tail was just as deadly as its teeth. Many rushed out too soon, thinking the worst had passed, only to be swallowed by the last convulsions of a dying gale. He waited, counting his breaths, listening for the subtle difference between rage and exhaustion. Hours later, silence returned in uneven waves. The wind retreated like an army unwilling to admit defeat, leaving behind only stray gusts that rattled the spines half-heartedly. He pressed his palm against the wall one last time, feeling the plant's steady strength, and whispered his gratitude into the chamber. Then he eased himself forward, widening the entrance with careful movements until sunlight cut into the dark, blinding after so long inside. He stepped out, pulling his cloak tight against the lingering dust that still rolled across the ground in thin sheets. The desert was no longer the same place he had entered. Dunes had shifted, ridges flattened, and hollows carved deeper by the relentless wind. Where the Velkari shield had once shimmered, only shards of cracked poles jutted from the sand like broken glass. The trench where a Corvin had buried himself was filled level with the rest of the desert. No sign of life left above the surface. Shattered equipment and twisted fabric littered the flats, half buried already, as if the desert was eager to erase the evidence of failure. He walked slowly, measuring each step, eyes scanning the landscape not for survivors, but for direction. He was not surprised by what he saw. He had known it would end like this. The storm had not been a test of strength, but of humility, and those who thought themselves stronger than the desert had been corrected. He adjusted the strap of his canteen across his shoulder and set his gaze toward the horizon where the beacon pulsed faintly in the distance, a soft light that marked the path forward. The desert was silent now, but silence did not mean peace. Silence was a pause, a breath before the next trial. He knew the sun would rise hotter the next day, and another storm might follow with less warning. He walked on, carrying not only his body, but the memory of those who had fallen, and in his silence there was both respect and resolve. The cactus that had sheltered him loomed behind, scarred now from the storm's fury but still upright, a monument to endurance. He glanced back once, the faintest curve of his lips acknowledging the gift it had given him, then turned away without hesitation. The storm had passed, but the test was not finished. He stepped forward into the new desert, his footprints the only fresh marks on the shifting sea of sand. When the desert finally stilled and the air cleared, the instructor's shuttles descended in disciplined arcs, engines stirring curtains of dust that settled over broken poles and scraps of failed shelters. Medics in sealed suits rushed into the field, their scanners already shrieking at faint life signs buried under the dunes. The human stood a short distance from the beacon's soft pulse, his cloak drawn close, his body marked with grit but steady. He had walked for hours through a reshaped wilderness, and now he watched the scene unfold with an expression that was neither triumph nor detachment, but something quieter, a recognition that the desert had chosen which lessons to leave behind. One instructor spotted him first. The figure raised a hand, signaling to the others, and the shuttles shifted to hover lower, casting shadows over the sand. A pair of medics approached him cautiously, scanning his vitals as if disbelieving that he could be upright, while others lay half-buried. The scanner lights swept across his chest and arms, showing steady rhythms and hydration levels better than expected. One medic exchanged a glance with the other and said nothing, simply recording the data. He accepted the scrutiny without resistance, his eyes following the horizon rather than the faces near him. The first Velkari survivor was dragged from a collapsed shield, crystalline body cracked in multiple places, voice weak as shards of sound fell from his mouth. The medics surrounded him with urgency, patching the fractures with biogel and murmuring reassurances. Further south, a Corvin was found unconscious beneath layers of sand, his cape stiffened into a brittle shell that had failed to keep the dust out of his lungs. The medics fought to stabilize him, their suits glowing faintly as oxygen was forced into his chest. The human watched without moving closer. He did not interfere with the rituals of healing because his part had already been played. He had survived by not fighting the storm directly, and now he survived by not intruding into the aftermath. When the instructors began to tally survivors, their voices carried through the comms in clipped tones. The list was shorter than expected, names repeated only once, sometimes twice, before silence filled the gaps. A hush settled across the ridge where the supervisors stood, each mirrored veil reflecting the scene of wreckage as if the desert had imprinted itself on their faces. The human remained near the beacon, hands folded lightly over his knees, his posture calm, as though the storm had been a passing lecture rather than a trial designed to break bodies. His presence seemed almost offensive in its steadiness. One instructor walked toward him, boots sinking into the sand with each step, and stopped only a few paces away. The voice that emerged from the veil was sharp, asking how he had endured when so many others had not. He met the gaze behind the mirror without flinching. His answer was not given in grand declarations. He said simply that the desert had offered him shelter and that he had accepted it. He explained no more, gave no details of the cactus chamber, no mention of the scent of damp pulp or the way the walls had glowed green. He spoke in plain words, as though survival was not a secret to hoard, but a truth so simple it needed no embellishment. The instructor's silence afterward was longer than the question had been. A shift passed through the surrounding staff, a faint unease mixed with reluctant respect. For all their technology and preparation, the human had endured by listening to the land rather than bending it. That fact unsettled those who had always believed superiority lay in control. The medics continued their work around the field, pulling more cadets from shallow graves, some conscious, others limp and silent. Each survivor bore marks of the storm: torn skin, fractured shells, shredded membranes. The human's marks were different. His cloak was dust-stained, his boots scuffed, but his body carried no sign of collapse. He looked not untouched, but aligned with the trial, as if the desert had tested him and decided he belonged. When the last survivor was tallied and the injured secured aboard the shuttles, the instructors gathered for a formal announcement. The cadets who remained upright were lined in a semicircle near the beacon, their bodies swaying with fatigue. The human stood among them, his gaze steady, his silence unbroken. The lead instructor declared the trial complete and listed the numbers without ceremony. The casualties were heavier than in previous years, a fact that darkened the voices of the staff. Yet in the middle of loss stood one figure who seemed carved from the lesson itself. His name was spoken with a pause, as if the syllables carried weight beyond their measure. As the announcement concluded, whispers rose among the cadets, whispers of disbelief and suspicion. Some muttered that he had cheated, that some hidden device must have aided him. Others spoke more quietly, with awe threaded into their doubt, admitting that perhaps he had endured through some instinct that could not be taught in academies. He ignored both. He neither defended himself nor sought their acknowledgement. He lifted his canteen, drank a measured swallow, and fixed his gaze once more on the horizon. The shuttles prepared to lift off, engines whining against the quiet. Before he stepped aboard, he looked back across the dunes one final time. The cactus that had sheltered him stood still in the distance, scarred yet upright, a sentinel that had offered him life when the storm sought to erase him. He raised a hand in a gesture of farewell, not for the instructors or the cadets, but for the land itself. The desert had written its lesson, and he had read it. He carried that truth with him as he walked up the ramp into the shuttle's metallic belly, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than the storm itself. The instructors spoke low as the hatch sealed, their voices half hidden but not fully. He caught fragments, words like impossible, primitive, adaptation. He did not need to hear more. He settled onto the bench, hands folded in his lap, and let his eyelids lower. The desert had ended its trial, but his mind replayed every grain of it, every whisper of wind, every vibration through cactus walls. He held those memories like tools sharpened and waiting, ready for whatever test came next. The hum of the shuttle lifted him away, but the desert was still inside him, alive and unyielding. The Academy's debriefing amphitheater was built like a terraced dune turned to stone, ring upon ring descending toward a central floor where a single table waited under white light. The light carried none of the desert's heat, yet the room felt warmer than usual because of the bodies packed along the tiers. Instructors stood behind mirrored visors, medics lingered in the shadows, and surviving cadets occupied the seats with bandaged limbs and raw pride scraped thin. The human walked down the steps without ceremony, cloak folded over one arm, boots leaving a faint patter that echoed longer than the motion deserved. He set the cloak on the chair back, sat, and rested his forearms on the table as if the furniture had been carved for precisely this posture. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and sand dust brought in on boots that had not been properly cleaned. He breathed it without flinching. He wanted the room to keep some trace of the world that had made the lesson matter. The lead instructor's voice came through a ceiling grid in a tone designed to flatten emotion into policy. The report began with numbers. Numbers were a language the Academy trusted. He listened as endurance metrics were compared to prior years, as casualty rates were plotted against predicted storm dynamics, as equipment failure modes were itemized with the neat cruelty of a spreadsheet. His name appeared in a column labeled Anomalies before it moved to a column labeled Exemplars. The transition took one sentence and a long pause. He did not smile. He was not interested in what columns said about him. He listened for the places where the report admitted ignorance, because ignorance was the only doorway worth opening. The report admitted that a test calibrated for layered technology had been solved by a choice that ignored technology altogether. The report kept speaking as if the problem were statistical. He waited. He understood institutions needed time to learn. When the metrics ended, the questions began. The youngest instructor asked first, voice quick and clear, as if speed could hide insecurity. She wanted a procedure, how he had identified a stable refuge, how he had minimized risk, how he had calculated hydration and heat load precisely enough to exit stronger than expected. He answered in steps, not as a recipe, but in the sequence of attention. Wind first, ground second, horizon third, rhythm always. He spoke about how pressure announced itself in the posture of sand, how the edges of ripples told the direction of change, how birds traced the thresholds of survivable air. He kept his sentences short so that each one could be examined without collapsing into a pile of stylized wisdom. He never used the word luck. He used the word listening. The room did not fidget as much during that word. The word offended fewer egos than skill. He let that be the bridge. An older instructor asked about ethics in competitive survival, the kind of question that arrived not from the field, but from the Academy's spine. She asked why he had not signaled others to follow once he had found refuge. He met the mirrored visor directly. He answered with the simplicity of a man who had measured choices under a clock he did not control. He said a signal would have revealed his refuge to the storm's teeth of chance and to the panic of those who might have overfilled a shelter not designed to hold many. He said he had made the decision to survive without widening the circle of failure. He let the sentence stand in the air. The room did not agree or disagree. The room understood that judgments in sand carried the same grain as sand, small, sharp, innumerable. The older instructor recorded his answer with a stylus that clicked twice. The sound made the amphitheater feel fragile. The medic's turn came without rhetoric. One medic asked about respiration inside an organic chamber, about condensation, about signs of hypoxia. He described the cycle of breath he had used, how he paced inhalations with the micro-vibrations of the living wall, how he had salted a cloth with a pinch of electrolyte strip to keep moisture exchange efficient. He did not claim invention. He described observation, and then he described trust. The medic nodded, not in approval but in recognition, and marked the note with a soft line. The human felt a small easing in his shoulders at the sound of pen against slate. Practical acknowledgement mattered more than praise. When the instructors turned to policy, the amphitheater's air changed. The lead instructor proposed a review of the test's calibration, an audit of energy shield dependency, a revision of the way the Academy taught storm behavior in environments where electricity misbehaved. The proposal spoke the language of committees. It suggested optional modules on non-technological shelter strategies. The human listened and pictured cadets being presented with a slide that said natural refuges and a bullet list beneath it. The thought tasted like sawdust. He requested permission to speak outside of the sequence. The lead instructor granted it with a tilt of the visor. He said the academy should not add a module. He said the academy should add a posture. The sentence paused the room. He explained that posture meant the habit of arriving without presumptions, the habit of measuring first and acting second, the habit of treating a place as a partner with terms rather than an enemy to dominate. He was careful with the word partner. He knew it would be mocked in private. He used it anyway. He finished by asking for an hour in the simulation dome, not to preach, but to walk the cadets through reading an environment without tools. The lead instructor stayed silent long enough to make refusal seem possible. Then she granted the hour. That hour unfolded 2 days later under a false sky and wind machines that tried to imitate the desert's grammar. The dome could not replicate life hidden in pulp or the taste of alkali remembered by a tongue, but it could demonstrate pattern. He moved alone across the sand while the cadets fanned out behind a transparent barrier, microphones carrying his voice to every seat. He did not perform. He narrated attention. He knelt at a ripple, pressed the pad of his finger to the windward face, and showed where grains had sheared abruptly. He stepped to the lee of a manufactured boulder and traced the eddy with a handful of grit, letting it pour in slow arcs so the physics under the dance could be seen. He held a feathered flag at knee height, and then at waist height, and then at shoulder height to show how air layered itself vertically, a stacked river with 3 dispositions. He did not mention the Cactus by name. He did not want refuge to be memorized as a brand. He wanted attention to be memorized as a practice. He left the dome without taking questions. He knew the questions would ferment better in silence. Words spread in ways he could not chart. Some cadets resented the calm of a man who had endured where others had bled, and resentment needed stories to survive. He permitted resentment to do its work. He spent his afternoons in the quiet wing of the library, reading topographies from worlds he had never walked. He looked for patterns that rhymed across planets, a fog that traveled uphill at dusk, a frost that formed under moss at noon, a clay that sang when stepped on in heat. He wrote none of it in a manifesto. He stacked it in his mind like a mason laid bricks. The Academy added an elective titled Environmental Literacy for Field Operators. He did not teach it. He asked to write the practical exam. The request was granted because no one else wanted ownership of failure at that scale. He designed an exam that did not ask for the correct answer. It asked for the correct sequence of attention. The scoring rubric rewarded noticing before acting. The first cohort cursed him privately and thanked him at graduation. The pattern felt honest. Weeks later, he was summoned to a brief ceremony that pretended not to be a ceremony. A commendation waited in a silver case on a podium, a small disc etched with the Academy crest, and a line of text that said he had demonstrated extraordinary adaptability in hostile conditions. He accepted the disc without a speech. He did not believe a man should thank a place for trying to kill him. He believed a man should thank those who learned something from the attempt. After the room emptied, he found Arasa in a corridor outside, the sylphid cadet who had once trusted membranes to read the desert's pressure. Arasa walked with a slow grace that spoke of cracked ribs knitting. He inclined his head in a gesture that contained no resentment. He said he wanted to understand posture. The human walked with him to the mezzanine and spent an hour speaking not about deserts, but about kitchens, about how a cook entered a room and knew if a sauce was burning just by the texture of the steam. Arasa laughed once, carefully, hand pressed to his bandage. The laugh sounded like something healing. The Academy adjusted the Sandstorm test quietly the following term. The calibration still included storms, but the orientation lecture changed. The slide titled Equipment Checklist now came second. The first slide was titled Reading the Room. The bullet points were simple. Listen for the smallest thing first. Treat beauty with suspicion. Honor ugly landmarks, count breaths before judging a horizon, measure silence as carefully as noise. He saw the slide once by accident as he passed a classroom door left ajar, and a warmth touched his chest he would not admit to anyone. He kept walking. On an evening that smelled of rain falsely promised by a cleaning system, he returned to the simulation dome alone and asked a technician to feed the program the exact storm pattern from the trial. The technician did not ask why. He stood in the false desert and watched the wind rise in the same sequence, listened to the same change in pitch, felt the same tug in the hem of his cloak. He did not reenact his steps. He stood very still and let gratitude move through him with the same discipline he used for breath. He was grateful to a plant that had no word for gratitude. He was grateful to instructors who had allowed policy to bend where pride might have kept it rigid. He was grateful to cadets who had complained loudly enough to make the change memorable. He was grateful finally to the man he had been on the first morning, the man who had chosen to arrive without a story and accept one from the land instead. He left the dome with the lights off, so the false stars could hold the ceiling a little longer. The semester closed under a thin winter sun that painted the academy's metal with the color of old straw. He packed his cloak and knife into a locker that smelled of oil and worn canvas, and he set the silver disc on the top shelf without a case. He did not polish it. He would not carry it. He preferred his hands empty when a new place spoke. On his way out, he paused at a window that faced a training yard where first years struggled under weighted packs. He watched a woman stumble and then correct her stride by shortening it a fraction, the exact fraction that saved knees over distance. He nodded once, not to her, but to the tiny truth she had found by feeling rather than thinking. He walked to the transit line, boarded, and sat with his shoulders relaxed. The carriage hummed with the same note as the shuttle had on the day of deployment, a note he had learned to count as a dull drum of hours. His eyes closed for a moment, not in sleep, but in the posture of a man who conserved what he owned. He would cross many more places. Some would be green and loud, others gray and stubborn, and a few would be cruel in new dialects. He would arrive, measure wind first, ground second, horizon third, rhythm always. He would look for partners among things that had no faces. He would keep his pride thin and his attention thick. The Academy would write another policy tomorrow, and another after that, shifting language to follow the path that a single man had traced by listening. He stepped off at his stop, the city air cool on his cheeks, and he smiled without showing teeth. The story had already ended where it needed to end, in a room where numbers admitted a gap and a man filled it with a posture. The desert had given him a bed and a sentence. He had slept inside a giant cactus and woken with a lesson that did not belong to him alone. He carried it without drama, a quiet weight that fit in the palm of his hand, and he walked forward with nothing chasing him but the wind.